Thanks. Thanks. And yeah, so as per usual, I'll start following Bree's example of a land acknowledgement, and just acknowledge that we're gathered here from a variety of different territories, many of them probably unceded and unnegotiated from Indigenous peoples who previously occupied the land. So think about where you are, where you're from, and appreciate that the land has been stewarded by people for many generations, and check out nativeland.ca to figure out where you might be, which lands you might be occupying. With that, today's lecture will be very sort of phoned in. I just going to talk very briefly about the two chapters, mostly because I didn't have enough time to prepare some good slides. And if I can't do good slides, I'm not going to do any slides at all. But I would encourage folks to read chapter 15 in particular, at least skim it. Chapter 15 is focused on the semantics of knowledge management and knowledge organization. It's a very complicated topic, which is why I'm saying skim it, because you might not want every single detail of the very theoretical kind of concepts and topics that Bedford dives into in chapter 15. But just very briefly, I'll give you the key takeaways. So chapter 15 focuses on exactly how you think about how you break up the things that you're kind of tracking in your knowledge management systems and knowledge architectures. The idea is that how you define one thing can mean, if you use the same words to define one thing in a different context, if you aren't careful about semantics, then you could actually mean something very different. It could be missing meaning, and it could be incomplete. And so in order to design effective knowledge architectures, it's really important to understand the full semantics of what you're trying to describe and capture, and use those semantics to be able to represent and capture things clearly. So that's basically the gist of this chapter. Is like there's a bunch of different ways you can go about thinking about this. There's a bunch of different levels of semantics. So you can look at what Bedford describes in order to understand when you might need to be what she calls, for instance, source specific. I forget the exact phrase, source specific or source agnostic. And so just as a quick example, if you use the term, let's use the term cappuccino to stick with my coffee examples theme from previous workshops or sessions. If you use the term cappuccino in one cafe, and then you just assume it means the same thing in every other cafe, then you're going to get very different drinks depending on whether or not the baristas know what they're talking about or not. And so that's an example of a term that might seem like it's source agnostic. A cappuccino should mean the same thing everywhere. But actually, in order to be source agnostic, when you describe what your preferred cappuccino is, you probably actually need to say, I want a drink that is 30 mils of espresso, and then I guess like probably another 30 mils of milk frothed a certain way at a certain temperature. And that's the only way for the barista to really actually understand what you want when you say you want a cappuccino. Most people don't care about their cappuccinos that much, but hey, might be specific. There is no ISO cappuccino standard. You're right. There probably really should be. So that's chapter 15. Be careful of semantics. Think carefully about how to break up, the nouns and the verbs and the relationships between them and the things that you're trying to capture in your notes and in your knowledge management systems and your databases, and look at the ways Bedford describes in terms of how to do that. Chapter 16 is focused on surrogating, which is a fancy word to describe the process of summarizing a piece of a knowledge kernel. So if you've ever done any kind of research reading, you know that at the top of every article there's an abstract, and that is one version of a surrogate of knowledge. Instead of reading the entire paper, you can read that abstract to get a very high level understanding of what exactly the article contains. And Bedford walks through a whole bunch of different types of surrogating. And just to describe the full range of the spectrum, the first of those is to provide a quick summary. So at a base level, providing a knowledge surrogate is simply summarizing whatever the thing is in as plain language as possible, so that, if you pick it up in the future, or if you give the knowledge kernel to somebody else, if you give the asset to someone else, they can read that description and get an understanding of what exactly it contains. And then on the far end of the spectrum is a critical knowledge surrogate. And that is where you actually say have a review. And a good review will both summarize the asset that you're looking at and also give the readers expert opinion on what that asset contains, whether it's valuable, how it might be used, and so on. And the overall goal for surrogates is to simply understand that accessing knowledge by looking at the whole of an asset, considering that that might be anything from, a photograph to a entire 1,000-page textbook. Surrogating is a very important way of making that knowledge accessible, as accessible as possible to an audience who doesn't have the space to read that 1,000-page textbook, or maybe even the visual abilities to see the photograph, right? And so that's the point of surrogating, is to try and extract in an abstract way information that is contained in a knowledge asset in a way that makes it accessible to a variety of audiences. The first thing really to understand about surrogating is you need to think about, when you're capturing something, like, do you need to surrogate it? The answer is probably going to actually be yes, although personally I don't practice surrogating maybe as often as I should. And then second, what the audience might be. If for that surrogate, are you working with a team and trying to capture, say, instructions on using Python to do the coding language Python to do a particular kind of task? And if so, then your surrogate probably needs to describe, say, both what the script does and then how exactly to execute on it if you're a non-technical non-coder who's not used to using these scripts. And maybe then you're surrogating knowledge that's contained in that script for a team who is using it to accomplish some sort of automation thing. And yes, that would be easier than training on Python. Easily. So yeah, that's an example of why you might surrogate knowledge for a team, but you might also want to surrogate knowledge for yourself. If you look at a paper and then 10 years later you're looking for that paper, hopefully you've extracted at the relevant details at first read 10 years ago, so that your 10 years later self can actually appreciate and understand it. So both social context, time context, all these considerations are important when thinking about surrogating and abstracting knowledge. And I think that's basically the wrap for those two chapters. Before we hit end on the recording, did I miss anything?
Wait, there's
crucial?
more. I have extra bonus slides from a presentation I did a while back.
Do you?
That work very well for.
So you're cheating. I could have brought up conceptual modeling and ontologies for my own information systems research, but I didn't want to drag that in. By all means.
So if I do share screen.
Mm-hmm.
Share screen. This is you can see the screen, right? It's like the
almost. I'm seeing that you've started screen sharing. Oh yeah, there you go.
Okay, so you can see vocabulary, control vocabulary, all that.
Yes.
Cool. So this is just like a presentation I did a while back, breaking down what different levels the semantic system is.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, basically, if you just think through it, the vocabulary is just you can put anything in the box. It's whatever you want. It's a tagging. You can tag anything, make it anything what you want. There's no limits to it, but it's also very uncontrolled. And to use the example she uses in the book, she talks about poverty remediation versus poverty alleviation, which on the surface are the same thing, but also are actually very different when you actually start thinking about it more thoroughly. And then you can also have a control vocabulary. That's like a spelling test, or a very specific language or country. You can only pick from a very specific list. That's it, nothing else. That's the entire universe. And then of course, you have taxonomy, which is push things in order from higher to lower, and gets more and more narrow or more and more broad. And I mean, examples that I have here is the red fox, which is in the animal kingdom. It's a phylum Chordata, it's a Mammalia, Carnivora, Canidae, Vulpes, which is just Latin for fox, isn't it? It's like the horse, which is equus, horse. And a thesaurus is just a much more it's linking things. So you can go up and down, but you can also relate horizontally. So when you have the word talk, you can say keep quiet, or you can have like a discussion or a discourse. Or if you're going down, you can verbalize it to make it sound. Or if you're going up, it can be a lecture. It's also all the little phrases over here: babble, blabble out, blab out. And that's what like most libraries use. And then of course, like the next step up is like when you're trying to tell a computer how language works. And that's what this is. It gets much more complicated when you have like a place is a subclass of a city in a country, which is a part of a domain of state of the population, and that range is in a number, and here's the number in the integer. So it's kind of at least hopefully a more helpful way of thinking for chapter 15, which I thought was really excellent. I will stop recording now, and I guess
wait.
Okay, go for it.
Sorry, that reminds me. I have one more thing to add on top of that. So just to make it super practical, because I think all of these sort of theoretics on top of what these things are might be hard to parse. I'm not going to show screen, but I just want to talk through an example. So we just talked through the 5 levels of semantics. And that example of vocabulary and controlled vocabulary are a good one. One way to think about this might be, so you have a bunch of, say, writing. You're publishing a blog, and you've got a bunch of writing. And that means that in your ontology of your writing, you actually have an understanding that there are certain statuses, right? Some posts are published, some posts are in draft, some posts are ideas, some posts are under review. So, okay, you've got this ontology, you've got this understanding that these different assets actually have a different type of status. And then you want to really make sure you keep track of that effectively. Well, if you just use a free-ranging vocabulary, you can, but when you're trying to then sort and filter and use, say, a specific type of query later on, if you've said some things are draft, or some things are in draft and some things are in ideation, but really there's sort of an in-between stage where you're thinking through an idea and you're outlining and something's in draft, then if you use different terms for those things, you can't actually compile them all very quickly and easily. And so there's a big sort of challenge there in the querying phase. After you've done all your sort of writing and you've got a bunch of pieces distributed across a computer, you've got a hard job when you're trying to figure out what you're going to work on next, because you've actually got to think about all of these terms and then uncontrolled vocabulary and actually make sure you find all the pieces you want. So controlling that vocabulary is actually a tactic that I've used in tagging status of items. So instead of just using the default sort of tag system that's on, say, Obsidian or Mac OS, I actually have an approach where I use a controlled vocabulary to tag everything. So I tap a button, it provokes a macro, and then instead of freely writing out the tags, I actually have to select. The only way I can tag something is selecting those particular items. So that means that everything gets the right kind of controlled language, and I don't have to worry about, did I use a different idea, or did I use a different concept to describe the state of this thing, or even did I misspell it? Did I write DARFT instead of draft so at some point when I was really tired? And so that's a practical example of the importance of semantics and of using the concepts that Bree just described. But then to add a little tiny bit more to it, if you take chapter 16 on extraction, abstract on surrogation, you might actually also want to surrogate the actual knowledge you're trying to capture about these different statuses. And so you might actually think about surrogating as being specific to the use of what you're trying to surrogate. So this is, again, the example is a bunch of blog posts you're writing. You've got a bunch of statuses. You might actually want to surrogate the next action for each blog post as a specific subpart of the document, of the asset. And so that way, when you're looking at, well, what are my draft posts, you can actually see that the next action for those draft posts is, write this paragraph here, instead of trying to understand, when you look at that big list of draft posts, what exactly you have to do by reading through each article in order to figure out what was draft about it, right? So that hopefully might make it practical, these two different chapters and what their focuses were. And I'll stop talking there.